Hi, my name's Ross Brewer from the Cyber Intel community, and today I'm joined by Alan Jenkins. For those of you who are not familiar with the Cyber Intel community, we're really about bringing on C-level executives that are practitioners, chief information security officers, that are high-level executives as well as practitioners from a cybersecurity standpoint. And the purpose is really where they can share their views, best practice, and opinion. So in terms of my background, 30 years cybersecurity, worked all over the world, originally from New Zealand, currently live in the UK, leading ATT&CK, which is a vendor out of the west coast of the US, in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So I'd like to thank Alan for taking the time. And when Alan and I were talking about this podcast, the challenge in security is how much detail you can go into without crossing the line as far as confidentiality and raising your head too far above the parapet. So what we're trying to do here is be educational, share as much information as possible, as freely as possible, but with that in mind. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Alan. And Alan, if you'd like to give the audience just a little bit about your background in terms of who you are and what you've done, and we'll go from there.
Thank you for that, Ross. And I must say this is a slightly humbling experience to be your first interview subject. So I'm the guinea pig. I get that. Nonetheless, I guess I fit into your practitioner category. I've been in the security field for more than 30 years, and I've been in the cyber field since before it was invented, probably since 2002, if I'm properly about it. So that's some 18 years now. And I've played both sides of the fence. So I come from a military background. I've served 21 years in the Royal Air Force as a police officer. But I've now been in commerce since 2006, and in the commerce, or the civvy street as I still refer to it, I've played both service provider and end customer, and I am currently an independent consultant trusted advisor. So I've got a practical experience that's well versed in multiple incidents and the responses to over the years. So I have battle scars. I've got it wrong on occasion, and I've learned from that experience. But to your point about how do we share this, I absolutely don't think we share it enough. But it is a challenge to go beyond the Chatham House rule and get to the point where we're sharing those nuggets that really make a difference. Part of me thinks that should be paid for because I'm a consultant, but it's a trust element, and I think that's something we can explore in this podcast and future podcasts with this community that you're looking to build, and I'm privileged to be a part of it.
Thank you very much, Alan, and that's a great intro. You raise a very interesting point in terms of payment. No one's getting paid here. We're just doing this in terms of information sharing and trying to share best practice, and that's the whole point of the channel. But as you say, it's much needed across the industry and the reason for us doing this. So Alan, when I look at bringing on people, or I look at executives, or in fact how I judge myself in terms of how I interact with the world, I tend to use a sort of a model. It's a pretty simple model. It's a practical model, a consistent way of sort of analyzing people and situations. And it's really made up of three very well sort of known matrix. Well, the third one maybe not so much, but certainly the first two in terms of the terms are. But I'll give you my definition and we'll sort of go from there. So I tend to look at people from a sort of an IQ, EQ, XQ perspective. So IQ, clearly that's typically characterized as intelligence. However, it's not about the person's schooling. It's not the university they went to. It's more about how they adapt their sort of intellectual experience into situations. You know, are they critical? Are they a critical thinker? You know, do they adapt, learn, and evolve quickly? Are they putting that knowledge into practical application? So, in terms of EQ, which is the emotional quotient, that's really looking at, say, a person from an integrity perspective. And it's not integrity in the sort of true sense of the word, it's more around how do they show up in a team environment? How do they lead? How do they influence? How do they bring people together to solve problems? It might be, in your situation, coming from a chief information security background, it may be vendor relations may be part of that as well. So that emotional piece is clearly very important. And the third leg to the stool, as it would be, is the XQ. And this is the sort of execution. How can the person take their knowledge and their relationships and then actually get the project done, or apply themselves in a way that moves the business forward and achieves the business objectives. So Alan, when you think about yourself going into a new organization and trying to get your hands around all the complexities and all the different technologies, there's so much in these big organizations that you have to get your hands around, develop a strategy, and then put that into some practical sort of application. So looking at it from a sort of an IQ, EQ, XQ, how would you sort of characterize your approach? And then also, how would you characterize the people you interact with? And then ultimately, what you look for? I know that's a fair chunk to get you started on, but I'll leave it over to you from here.
Start with the deep end, shall we, Ross? No, thank you for that. And I'll come back to the XQ piece, because I think the execution is all important, and in many ways that's the measure of effectiveness, measure of success that we're actually weakest on in security. So I'll come back to that if I may. In terms of what I bring to it, is very much a mix of the IQ and EQ, and I liked your qualification on the IQ piece, because and I'm not alone here. It's quite an interesting. There's a psychology angle to this, but I failed my university degree, so I do not have a bachelor's, and I know of a few of us who are of that ilk, but I also know people who didn't go to university at all and yet are very successful. So what is it about us that allows us to do that? So I liked your definition of IQ, because it is about the ability to apply intellect, yes, but apply it in a fashion that delivers success, hence my interest in the XQ. But as I've grown in seniority, I'm also become aware that I have to be careful not to think that I've seen this before. That might well be true, but there'll always be some subtleties and variations that are different with the client that I'm working with. And actually, most of my time in the early phase is to understand their business environment, not so much the problem, because I need to understand what might or might not work in terms of a solution for their business, because the problems are quite common, but the solutions need to work for their business. So that's where in a sense, that's where the 80-20 or even a 70-20-10 comes into the solution piece. Is there are some basics that need to be put in place. We call them the foundations, or the base hygiene levels that need to be applied. And depending upon the outfit's cyber maturity, they'll either have them or they won't. And that's probably where I start to gauge as to what the solution might look like. But I have to be careful how I pose those questions, because initially I've probably been drawn into it after a breach. Sometimes it's before the breach, and I prefer that, but more often than not, it's after something's gone wrong. And it might even be after they've tried to fix it once and it didn't work. That's not uncommon. So I have to be a little bit delicate about how I ask my questions, particularly in terms of my former police style of questioning, isn't necessarily the right approach for some outfits. So I've become much more, I'm not a diplomat. I don't think I'd ever pass the diplomatic service test, but I've had to be more sensitive, which is where your EQ comes in. So my questioning style is less direct than it used to be. I still tend to be direct if I'm not thinking about it. So I've had to soften my approach, at least in those early stages, as I understand what the problems are. And of course, even the language issue is not a problem. It's an opportunity to improve. It's not about establishing cybersecurity rules, because that's not a good line to take externally. It's about improving and building upon what they had already. So already I'm into sophistry and to some extent spin management. And I put that in the EQ space. And that's not something I learned in the military. It's something I've had to develop over the last nearly 15 years now that I've been in Civvy Street. But that's all building up to how we execute. Because what I find myself doing, and I suppose to some extent I'm doing now, is I find myself telling stories more. Because people don't get the jargon, and it's all too easy to drop into 3 and 4 letter acronyms and the technology soup, and that's not what the business are wanting to hear. So the first thing I've got to do is reassure them that I know what good looks like and there is a way out of this, because they're probably in a bit of a panic. So the first thing I have to be is exercise my EQ and calm the situation down. And that's not necessarily easy to do, particularly if they are in the midst of it. But you do have to be that still small voice of calm. And I use Rudyard Kipling's If poem as a guiding for me. It's something I learned at school, and it's stuck with me. So, whilst those around you are losing their heads, make sure you keep your own. And I plagiarized it there, but you'll forgive me. It is an essential piece, and for me, that crosses that EQ into XQ space that you mapped out at the start. But something that I think vendors in particular are not so good at, and at this point, I'm probably including the service providers, so not just the technology developers, but also the service providers. They're not so good on the measures of effectiveness side. And from the business, that's where our weakness, I think, is greatest, whether that's in the threat intelligence space, because to a large extent, the business doesn't care who it is that's attacking them. They just want the attack to go away so that they can get back to running their business. And that could be a COVID-19 environmental issue, or it could be a nation state attacker. The business actually doesn't care. Their focus is on whatever their business outputs are and returning to normal such that they can hit their quarter targets. That's what they're interested in. So that's why the execution has to have some measures of effectiveness in it. But equally, we have to make it clear to the business, depending on where we're starting from, that might be a bit of a journey, because there is no silver bullet. There is no technology solution. There is no process solution, one solution that will fix the problem. Hence the storytelling. You've got to tell them that there is a way out of this, but it's unlikely to be an overnight fix. But sometimes you do need to buy time. So you have to look for the quick wins to buy you that time to do the things that take longer. And you and I know this from when we first met back in 2013 now, as you build your capabilities to allow you to defend your enterprise better. That does take time, and that's where professional services comes into being, into importance. And for me, that's the XQ piece. You've got to know why you're doing something. You've got to know what you're going to do. You've got to know how you're going to do it. But you should always keep an eye on what's the business benefit at the end of it. Because the CFO won't thank you for spending, for argument's sake, £1 million if actually I'm only mitigating a risk that's 500,000. That's not going to get sign off from anywhere. So somewhere in there, we have to have a value return. That might be reputational restoration. That's probably the most ethereal. But for me, that's all in the XQ.
So, Alan, it's interesting. Some of the things you raised there. Don't build $1 million fence around a dollar asset. Clearly, focus those investments. Look at your managed service provider. Who's policing the police? So, if the managed service provider is running your infrastructure, how do you gauge whether they're doing their job effectively, which is clearly always a challenge. So, Alan, when you go into these large organizations, just the sheer complexity around the technology is overwhelming. How do you sort of practically sort of break it down into sort of, as they say, you can't eat an elephant, you got to eat it a chunk at a time, but how do you break it down to those bite-sized chunks so that you can get the board of directors and the C-level executives in step with you and locked into the plan that you want to sort of roll out?
It's an interesting one. So I'll pick up straight off on the large and complex, if I may, because there's not necessarily an automatic correlation between the two. I think there's a correlation between complexity and age of the business. So the chances are the older the business, the more complex they are, probably because they've been through a number of mergers and acquisitions. And there's probably a legacy tech in there, but that can apply equally to a small outfit as it can to a multinational global outfit. Because there are some remarkably agile new outfits who leverage the cloud straight off, so they don't have that legacy tech issue, but they can still be quite complex, but they're actually easier to work with because they're using a cloud technology. That doesn't mean cloud's necessarily the answer, by the way, but it does make things slightly easier to achieve the objective that we're looking for. But to that last point, I kind of work the problem backwards. So for me, it's what's the problem facing the business, but what does the end result look like for the business that they want to achieve? Is that a restoration of customer confidence? Is that a recovery of their share price? And if it is recovery of share price, how soon? So that tends to link to where are they in their fiscal year? Have they got their annual general meeting coming up? Do they need to postpone the annual general meeting perhaps because they can't declare their results? And obviously we had a good example of that back in 2017 with, I think it was Reckitt Benckiser, who had to delay the announcement of their results because of a WannaCry incident, and they couldn't use their financial system. So if you follow that one, it's working it back from what does the end result look like. Then you get into, okay, what is the specific problem? What is the root cause of whatever has triggered the incident? But the complexity piece then comes into play of, well, what are the tools that are immediately available to me to use? Because the chances are they're not necessarily all being used to their full effect. Because as a community, we've tended to throw a point solution at a point problem, and there hasn't been enough thinking about integration and can this tool cover this area, not just this area of activity. And one of the things that I've used increasingly of late to focus that thinking is either the NIST cybersecurity framework, and forgive me, I'm probably going to start crossing over into that jargon of our world, but something that's called the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I first came across MITRE back in 2002 when I was in the UK MOD's stand-up team for computer emergency response, and I was working with our US allies over in Washington. It quite quickly became apparent that the US DoD had contractors, quite a large contractor mix within their team, but they also had a trusted outfit by the name of MITRE. The closest counterpart on this side of the pond today is probably Kinetic, but it's more the DSTL side of Kinetic that stayed in government, because MITRE is a quasi-government agency, albeit it does have a commercial arm. So that's where the corollary to Kinetic goes. And I'm not aware of a similar outfit elsewhere in Europe, but that just might be my ignorance. But anyway, back to the MITRE attack framework. It leverages a bit of work that was claimed by Lockheed as the cyber kill chain. I always say claimed by Lockheed. Lockheed published a paper on it, but I know we were using the term cyber kill chain in the military field as far back as 2002 when I visited the US Air Force Information Warfare Center in Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. And that's where I first came across the technology. And that was some 5 years, I think, before the Lockheed paper was published. So the MITRE attack framework is useful because it makes you look at what tools are in place against the various stages of a cyber attack. And it focuses you on what tools have you got in place, but more importantly, where you might have gaps, because it's those gaps that have probably been exploited by the attacker. That's not to say if you've got a control in place, that control is 100% effective. So the old security principle of defense in depth still applies. If you've only got one control, you probably want at least one more to give you what we call double coverage. And that's both a soccer and an American football term, so I think it still applies. And it even applies on the rugby pitch sometimes, but less often. That attack framework is very useful when I am talking to the board because they can start to understand it. It's not technical. It's actually really talking about process and the process steps that an attacker goes through, from reconnaissance through to exploitation to getting away with the money at the end of it if it's a bank heist. That's kind of how it approaches, and a board can understand that. I don't have to talk technical jargon for them to understand that. Where it starts to get more difficult is when we talk about the controls that we insert to make it harder for the attacker, because most of the time we're buying ourselves time. So one of those measures that the industry uses at the moment is the mean time to detect. And you'll hear is it 200 days, is it 87 days, or is it anything in between? That figure has not come down enough. We're still talking in multiples, tens of days. I think universally, I think if you look at the latest Verizon Threat Research Report, if you track that over the last 10 years, it's still far too close to 100 days, and it's nowhere near the 1 day, which is probably near where it needs to be. So the attacker has a lot of what we then call dwell time in the network. And that's bad, because if the more time they have in the network, the more time they have to make their presence what we call persistent, which means they may well know your network better than your own network engineers do, because they're not quite so hidebound by areas of activity as your own teams are. And they're also motivated to find those critical assets, which are often about where the money is made, or where the money is stored, or where the sensitive information is, whether that's relating to your R&D or to your people. That kind of depends on the nature of your business, or indeed your patients, given the focus on healthcare at the moment. So that dwell time is something we want to reduce. But it's not just about the time to detect or even just the time to respond. It's actually, from the business's point of view, what they're interested in is how long before we get back to business normal. So that time to recover, to that time to restore normal service, that's the measure that matters most to the business. And that's the one, as an industry, we still struggle with the most. And I think that's an area where this community can probably bring some collective thinking, collective sharing of things that work. But given that it's intelligence, that's not just who the threat actors are, that's not just how the threat actors operate, It has to be more sharing about what works to stop them operating, to stop them being effective. And for me, we start to cross over from that, as I used to call it, computer network defense, and get more into the computer network response, if not computer network attack. And we'll get into a debate about hack back. And I'm conscious of the legal prohibitions in the UK of the Computer Misuse Act from 1990. But at the moment, I don't think we make life hard enough for the attackers. The legal process is struggling to prosecute, certainly struggling to sentence. But that's even before we've investigated and presented the evidence. And in the meantime, too many of the attackers are making too much money. And I don't like that, which with whatever hat I'm on, whether it's as a father, as a responsible adult, as a tax-paying citizen, or as somebody who knows how bad it is out there, we've got to make life more difficult for the attackers.
I think that's true, Alan, and I have to sort of thank you. I mean, just listening to you speak and talking about these subjects, which we do often, but it's not done in public, and I just think that it's time in the industry where the vendors, the service providers, and the customers need to come together and collaborate more. And I think the MITRE ATT&CK framework is an interesting model, and there's a lot of work being done on that on a global basis. And I think it is the standard by which most people are being able to now have a conversation. So I'd like to sort of move the conversation on now to sort of the Security Operations Center and the analysts themselves, the sort of concept of the red teaming and the blue teaming, and now more so the purple teaming, where it's more of a collaborative effort that we're seeing in enterprises today. It used to be the red team would come in, these are the pen testers, and they would show vulnerabilities and go, oh, look, we found this, and look how bad you are, and the poor server teams that hang their heads low and go away and try and sort of fix it all. And it was sort of not that sort of productive, whereas now it's more about, right, you're the server team, you're the network team, you're the applications team, we're going to use the MITRE ATT&CK framework, we're in petrochemicals or we're in banking, these are the most likely groups that are going to go after us, these are the tools that they're going to use, these are the tactics, the procedures and so forth that the MITRE sort of attack framework stands for. So let's work together. You go and secure these assets based on those vectors and tactics and techniques, and then later on we're going to come in and we're going to test to see, as you said, to see if the security technologies are implemented correctly, configured and communicating through to the central system in the SOC, and whether the actual control is able to be evidenced, and the actual SOC analyst sees that security technology mitigated that risk or missed that risk, and it popped up in the SOC. So again, I just want to thank you. This is really interesting information, especially for those that have not had the opportunity to speak to a Chief Information Security Officer or a high-level executive that's got the battle scars and the war stories that you've got. So just want to sort of hand back to you to sort of think about that SOC element and those analysts and how you sort of encourage them to sort of educate themselves as well.
The SOC, the Security Operations Center, and those analysts, they are the critical assets, both in your technology process and people element of how you're going to defend your enterprise. So key to the XQ piece of your triumvirate. And I'm sat here looking at myself in a small screen, and I'm reminded of the 3 penguins over my shoulder. They're actually rockhopper penguins, and they remind me of my time in the Falklands back in the early 90s, not for the conflict. I was there 10 years later. But it was the first time I worked in a tri-service environment as opposed to my single service of the Royal Air Force. and I was actually in the intelligence staff at headquarters British Forces Falkland Islands. So I wasn't just in the Falkland Islands wearing blue in my RAF police guise as a security officer. I was actually the theatre security officer and an intelligence officer within the staff, reporting into an intelligence corps major, but we had a Royal Navy lieutenant, and the general officer commanding at the time was Army, but there was a change of command during my 6 months, and we had an Air Force commander come in after that. But I'm reflecting on that because it has quite a neat analogy to your blue, red, and purple team. Because you can't do this with just the team immediately around you. So it's not just about the Security Operations Center, it's also about your network operations team. Because your security folks are really there as the guardians, but as the people to say there's a problem. But actually the security team are not often able to fix the problem. They have to reach out to the rest of the IT team, or if it's beyond the IT world, to those teams who are responsible, and that might include facilities. It might be your cooling system for your data centers the problem. Well, that's in the facilities space. So the point I'm getting to here is it has to be a multidiscipline piece, but somebody's got to orchestrate that, and somebody's got to do the command and control. And I'm conscious I've just started to use a military terminology, but it's hard not to, so forgive me. But that Security Operations Center often becomes the crisis management center. It often has to draw in additional people. So one of the things when I did my managing a cert course at the Carnegie Mellon University in Pennsylvania back in 2002, that I keep talking about as part of my storytelling, is the importance of communications. That communications piece, internal, but particularly external, is so important to instill confidence, to reassure people, both your own staff, but also your customers, your suppliers, your shareholders, your external agencies, whether they're regulators or government bodies, depending on the nature of your business. Communications is pivotal. And that's not something I'd expect an analyst to be able to do. But I would expect the analyst to be able to provide information to the communications expert who's going to put that communique together. And that's why I emphasize the multidisciplinary piece. So to your point about blue teams, red teams, and purple teams, and I'm conscious of the color coordination because this is definitely military. So if you're unsure, blue are the good guys. Right, and it actually goes to the NATO flag is blue, and that's the side that we talk about, at least in the Western Hemisphere. And unfortunately, the bad guys are often depicted as a red flag. That's just the way it goes. But I can assure you that the French across the English Channel have been our oldest enemy for 1,000 years, and that doesn't really change when it comes to economic competitor. So the colours are euphemisms. It's about blue is for defense, red is for attack. So the idea of using a red team who might be outsiders, they might be ethical hackers, or if you're big enough, you might have your own red team to play how the bad guys operate. So this is using a principle established by Sun Tzu some 2,500 years ago, which is a combination of know your enemy and know yourself. So the blue team have to know your own business. The red team have to know how the attackers will attack. That doesn't mean they can only attack like an attacker. They've got their own intelligence to your IQ piece. But by and large, they'll be using the tools, techniques, and procedures that are known to be used by the bad guys, because that's the simulated attack that you're wanting to defend against. Excuse me. Because the first thing you've got to be able to do is to defend what you know is used against you. So that's the combination of know your enemy and know yourself. And that's where the combination of blue and red comes together. I've more often than not been running the blue team. But 20 odd years ago, I ran the Air Force's red team just as we started to play with cyber. So I ran the first advanced intruder test into it's actually an MOD asset, not an Air Force asset, where we used, didn't call it cyber then, where we used open source intelligence techniques to find out more information about the target being an establishment, but also the people who ran that establishment. And what I now call social engineering was something we utilized. And these are all techniques that the red team will use against you. But to some extent, the blue team needs to understand that as well. So just as the bad guys are learning about you, the blue team have got to understand about the bad guys, because there is a cause and effect. There is the sword and shield element that we talk about in security. The defenders tend to have the shield. But I'll come back to that. The best form of defense is attack. And at the moment in the cyber world, we don't have that attack response. I will come back to that. But at the moment, the defenders are there with the shield. But you've got to know what is the right shield to use against the different varying forms of attack, because it won't be the same response. And that's where the simulation, I won't call them war games, but that's where the crisis response exercises, the simulated attack and defense against a model of your environment. We've got to the point now where the technology will allow us to do that in the fifth domain, that is cyber, that we've long been able to do in the other three domains, and to some extent the fourth domain, by the way, being outer space, if you didn't know that. Obviously, land, sea, and air being first, second, and third domain. Sorry, forgive me, it's that military technology again. So the cyber domain is the fifth domain. And the interesting thing about the fifth domain, probably just as much with the fourth domain, but more so with the fifth domain, is that it touches all the others. Right? There is nothing you can do in the other four domains in the 21st century that the cyber domain doesn't touch. That's affecting the way the army, NATO's armies are deploying into the Baltic today. They've had to relearn lessons about deception and camouflage, because it's no longer just protecting themselves against infrared and overhead surveillance. They've had to literally take personal phones away from the soldiers so that they neither use them to convey information, nor do their phones beacon out where they are. That's a fifth domain attack. And that's something that, because they've largely been doing counter-revolutionary warfare for the last 10 years, they've had to relearn that. But the piece here is we can now simulate all of these activities in a fast computational environment that is a true simulation, close to true simulation, I suppose, if I'm really honest, that we've not been able to do before. So the idea of cyber ranges has been around for a little while. I'm going to play my former IBMer card, because once you've been an IBMer, you're always an IBMer. IBM introduced a mobile cyber range. It was actually on the back of a flatbed truck, and it wasn't cheap to build it in the first place. When it first came to Europe, I think it was 2 years ago now, 2018, sorry. First came across to this side of the pond. But that's taking this notion of practice to the business, rather than having the business go to a special range, in IBM's case, in downtown Boston. So you're taking the solution to where the problem is, and that is essential to improve the collaboration, the effectiveness of that multidisciplinary team. So I think that's a pretty long-winded answer to your question about the importance of the SOC of the analysts. But I don't think you can look at them in isolation, but you do have to recognize that they are at the heart of the defense team to marshal the resources. to your XQ point, because it's all about executing the defense of the enterprise, and that's not done by one team on their own.
The whole purpose to this channel is really just getting some faces and some voices that have got a huge amount of practical experience, and sharing those with the community, and sharing those in the industry, because I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned and a lot of shortcuts that can be taken if people just knew, like if we all knew what we know now 20 years ago, we'd do things very, very differently. And no, this is excellent. And I just have to sort of say, if people want to sort of like, subscribe, make sure that they ring the bell in terms of making sure that they get the next interview that we do with another. I've got another 2 or 3 Chief Information Security Officers that have kindly sort of signed up to do this. I have to say, Alan, I appreciate you being the first, and I think this information's great. As far as your peers go, is there anything that you'd like to say as we sort of near conclusion here, in terms of your peers or young people coming up through the ranks in cybersecurity, threat intelligence?
Ross, that is a tough question. One piece of advice? Wow. I'm going to start with the positive, I think. I think the positive is there is a lot of room for improvement in terms of what we do on the defensive response side. That's not because we don't know what we should do. It's mostly about being given the remit to do it. And some of that is a lack of confidence in the business that we do actually know what we're doing. Because if you just take a step back, they're not used to security being so important to the business. You know, if you stick your MBA hat on and you look at what the MBA students are taught, certainly in the Western Hemisphere since the late 80s, a lot of it is about where do you sit in the value chain. Are you a producer or are you a supporter? Are you selling or are you supporting a sale? And the answer is, if you're in neither of those categories, then I don't need you. And the organizations have leaned out that back area into the productive and the not quite so productive space. And security has always struggled with that, because when you actually look at it, who was it? It was Professor Michael Porter at Harvard, I think in 1988, I think was when he wrote his value chain paper. If you look for security in there, you will find quality assurance, you will find health and safety. Security doesn't get a mention. So is it any wonder that the business leaders since that day, most of them have gone through an MBA, most, I'm exaggerating, a lot of them have gone through the MBA process. They've not recognized the importance of security. And that's our fault as an industry, myself, my peers, my forebears. We're not good at talking about our value add. We're not actually good at talking about our successes at all. Our failures are very obvious, but our successes are not. And that's our fault. That's one of the reasons why I'm on here, is to try and let that next generation know that we did get some things wrong, but we have learned to learn as we've gone along. Don't take 30 years to get to the same space that I'm at now. You've got the advantage. I and others like me are willing to share that experience so that you can get to me quicker and then go beyond. And I look forward to that day, because then I can retire. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So that's my challenge to the younger generation, is the sooner they can pick the ball up off me and my peer group, the sooner I will be cheering them from the stands. Challenge to the younger generation. You talked about lessons learned. One of the things that frustrates me is I don't think we learn lessons very well. I think we're very good at identifying lessons, and I am getting slightly pedantic here. We're very good at identifying lessons, but as a community, we don't learn them until we have to. We're not actually very good at learning the mistakes of others and making sure that we don't repeat them. And that's one of my frustrations. And some of that is because as a community, we don't share what worked. And I'm going to call on the Chatham House rule here explicitly, because I had a very interesting time as one of my gigs as a CISO, where on day one, I hadn't even finished my induction, and I was told that in 2 hours I was going to be chairing a crisis call, and the CIO was absent sick, because we just had a call from the national agency that the bad guys were back in because their clean-out operation had not been as successful as they had hoped. So that was day one. And I had a very interesting that's an underestimate. So for those who are not British, that means it's one of the reasons why I don't have much hair. 7 months. And in that time, there are some key moments in that process as we as we successfully built our capability to the point that we could take back our network and keep the bad guys out. That was our end game. And we worked up a plan as to how we were going to do that in a timeline. But there were two pivotal moments there that stay with me. And this is more than 5 years ago now. One of them was that we got to the point by early September that we were ready to initiate our clean-out operation. The business asked us to wait because they weren't ready. There were a couple of things going on in the business cycle, but not least of them was mid-year results. So we had to wait until after the mid-year results, the financials had come in, turned the handle, and all the results had gone out to the market. Because what we were about to do was going to affect share price. That was their fear. Because the chances are it would leak that the outfit I was working for was having to respond to a cyber incident. So there was a business concern that would affect share price. And then there was a CFO concern that he wanted to get his numbers out because, as subsequently became public knowledge, there was a big acquisition towards the end of the year that was a major acquisition. So what it focused me on was the business was telling me we had a window of opportunity that we could do what we needed to do, but I had to finish it by such and such a date, because on such and such a date, which was only about 2 weeks later, they were looking to close a deal. So that was one pivotal. So we had to wait. It was about 6 weeks, actually. We had a pause of about 6 weeks when we were ready to execute, but the business asked us to wait. So that was one lesson, and I've seen that happen since. So that's not one-off. But about a month before we were ready to act, we detected the bad guys were back in our network doing what they do, maintaining their persistence, maintaining their presence. And I had to go to the CEO and CFO, who were the two key decision makers. CIO was with me, but he was in support rather than in the lead, which is interesting because he was my boss. But I had to say to the CEO and CFO, we've detected the bad guys, they're in the network, but we're not ready to throw them out. So we need to tolerate them being in the network for a period. And we want to learn where they go and what they do and how they do it. And that was all to gain intelligence value. But from their point of view, from the business point of view, I was asking them to allow the bad guys to do what they will. That was a very uncomfortable discussion. And indeed for them, I was putting them on the spot to make a decision because I was giving them the advice, but I wasn't a decision maker. And that's something that holds true for most CISOs. They're not actually a decision maker, they're an influencer. Very few CISOs actually even have control over their budget, let alone over what it is they do. They have decision over how they do it, but even then that has to get signed off. But sorry, I'm slightly digressing, but that conversation with the business to condone effectively criminal activity on the network was very uncomfortable. but the treatment, if you will, and I've just lapsed into the jargon again, we weren't ready to apply, because though I could have tactically thrown them out of the network, I wasn't 100% confident that I could keep them out. And by throwing them out of the network, we'd have tipped our hand that we had detected them. We'd have got an improved capability, and we weren't confident that we had all of the back doors mapped out. So the intelligence value we gained from that monitoring activity was that they went to all of the compromised assets that we'd already identified as compromised. They went to no new assets that we didn't already know had been compromised. So from our point of view, we had confirmation, if you will, that their 4 points of entry were known to us. And I'm actually being quite precise with my information here. So this is probably TLP Amber. Sorry, I've just used a 3-letter acronym. TLP, Traffic Light Protocol. So this is where we disclose information that is useful, that is an indicator of compromise, that discusses techniques, but I'm actually to some extent disclosing our response, which is not something we do enough of. But I think for the purposes of this community, it's what we should be doing more of. And if we weren't being recorded, I'd be speaking even more freely. So forgive me. That intelligence value gain from that monitoring, it was about 4 days from when we first detected until we watched them go off the network, was valuable. Incredibly valuable, and not just valuable to us, so not just valuable to my business, it was valuable to the third-party company of experts that we had supporting us, because we weren't doing this all off our own backs. But it was also of interest to the national agency. I don't think that won't come as any surprise. So I'm talking about GCHQ here. So Government Communications Headquarters, the UK's lead agency for both offensive and defensive cyber, were very interested in what we discovered about the tools and techniques being used by this attack group. And I'm just pausing as to how much linkage I do to what's in the public domain. So back in 2005, the UK and US agencies went public with an attributed attack that was actually attributed to China. And I'd been part of that investigative team and effort back in 2003 when we first came across it. And I actually made the linkage between the UK investigation and the US investigation, because I was having a conversation with my counterparts whilst I was in Washington, DC in the August or so of 2003. And if you do your open source research, the Americans called that Titan Rain. I don't think the UK code word is in the public domain now yet, so I won't use that, but that was what was behind the public announcement in December of 2005. Because the challenge we have in the intelligence community, remembering what this channel is about, is often about attribution. Because if you can't attribute the attack, you don't know who to respond to, whether that's legal reparation or prosecution or any of your other response options. And that's one of the frustrating things from the business, is that they've had to throw a lot of money at the defensive game, but the attackers are getting away with it too often scot-free. Back to why the intelligence was useful, because in the course of that 4 days of monitoring, we had some confirmation of tools and techniques, but we also identified some previously unknown tools and techniques used by this particular attack group. And that was something that was of strategic intelligence value to GCHQ, because they were able to share that with their US counterparts as part of the intelligence trading game that goes on between nation states. Because there's something they call It's we in the community call equities. So there's always a trade-off between what you can use offensively and what you use defensively. Because if you defend against everything you use in your offensive armory, your offensive capability is blunted. And there's a trade-off in the intelligence game between, well, how much do we want to share the good practice? Because if we share that too openly, then the bad guys will learn from that as well. So they call it equities, and it's literally a trading between sword and shield. And you'll see that sometimes referred to. And in fact, I think Ian Levy from the National Cybersecurity Centre talked about that for the first time publicly last year, where he talked about this equities game between defence and attack. It's the first time I think I've seen that in public forum. But the intelligence value we got out of this monitoring period included some decryption of the command and control channel that the attackers were using. The decryption was performed by our third party, and that was the first time that encryption channel had been broken, at least as far as we're aware, anywhere. And that actually enabled some parallel disruptive activities to go on into other attacks being conducted by this attack group, because we weren't the only ones that were being attacked. They're busy bees, shall we say, the bad guys. They have their tentacles in a lot of outfits. So what was a difficult conversation for my business leadership, strategically was key to our success 3 months later. Because when we did get the go-ahead and enacted our recapture operation, which we did over a weekend, because these things take time, and we got the confirmation about 3 weeks later from GCHQ that they had detected some traffic from the bad guys, that they had tried to get back in, but they'd been unsuccessful. We'd seen some of that in our detection space, but not all. How they knew that, how they had the confidence to say that, I will leave them to comment. That's not for me to speculate, but we're well above the security grading for this conversation, I'm afraid. Was valuable. But I've never been allowed to talk about this in public, because my business at the time were wary of sticking their head above the parapet. So I have not been allowed to share what we did, how we did it, why we did it in a public forum. And I'm still not allowed to, because I'm under a confidentiality agreement that's supposed to last me for the rest of my life. And that frustrates the hell out of me.
Alan, this is the sort of fascinating sort of conclusion to the conversation, and everything you've just said is really super interesting, and I'm sure it's super interesting to the subscribers and the people that are watching this. And what advice can you give to vendors and those working for vendors and even managed service providers trying to get to the C-suite and get to people such as yourself?
Oh, that's really tough, because I hate those cold calls, right? You know, I and a lot of my peers put as many barriers up as we can to make sure that those cold calls don't reach us. But at the same time, that doesn't work. You know, I've got the same mobile number that I've had since 1995 as my constant mode of communication, because when I move employers, my company mobile number changes all the time. So unfortunately, I still get cold calls, and depending on who it is and what their approach is, my response will vary. So to your point, I'm increasingly focused and have become more focused on what's the business problem I'm solving. Not what's my cyber problem, it's what's the business problem. And therefore I focus on what's the business value gained from tackling this problem, what's the investment I've got to put into it, what's the upfront investment, which, by the way, is not just the purchase cost for the solution. It's not just the licensing cost. It's my internal cost to set up and run a project that's going to implement this, which goes to your XQ piece. That execution plan has to be through life, not just proof of concept, because I have to plan for success. It's that POC is going to be successful. Am I going to have the budget to buy this in year, or am I going to have to defer this to next year, or is it so valuable in terms of capability that it's worth me asking for an early spend? So to dip into that contingency pot that either my CIO or my CFO always has for the unexpected. So in terms of how I would want a vendor to approach me, I'd want the vendor to approach me with a value proposition, not just a cost proposition. And not many of them do that. The other thing I'd like them to do is to come to me with some assurance of their product. That means assurance about the back end, not just that it does what it says it does on the tin. I need to know that this is going to be safe to employ in my enterprise, that it's not going to introduce any additional risk into my enterprise. It is only going to reduce risk. So I need to know that your remote support mechanism, pertinent when we're in a lockdown situation for COVID-19, is robust, is secure, that there's some kind of authentication mechanism in there, and I'm not creating myself a privacy violation because I'm allowing unknown third parties to access our sensitive data stores. I don't see many vendors so far doing that. So I think they've got two things to improve: their value proposition and their assurance to the CISO, the prospect, that they're actually introducing a secure tool into the security portfolio. So rather than one thing, I'd ask them to do two things.
And Alan, we've come up to our hour, and I think you've given some sort of tantalizing information, and I'm sure the community would love us to go further. And they're like, "Whoa, Ross, is this still why are you pulling the plug?" And I want to try and sort of keep these interviews to about an hour. And here's the chair that you would have been sitting in. We set up the studio pre-COVID, and this was meant to be in person, but I think I've just lost one camera to my right here, so I'm focusing on the second camera, and hopefully we've got the Zoom recorded here. But Alan, this has been fascinating, and I know it puts you outside your comfort zone. I know it's a big ask. It means a lot to me, and I'm sure it'll mean a lot to other people. It's been absolutely inspiring for me to hear this. I've known you for a long time. I've heard some of this before, but I learn things every time I listen to you, and I really appreciate it. And I just want to sort of say to the community out there, if you found this tantalizing, if you do want to learn more, there are going to be Alan's peers are lining up to do this, and so in order to spread this information and get the information out there, we really need your support. We need you to like, we need you to share, we need you to comment, we need you to flip the bell. So Alan, I want to thank you very much for your time, and say that I couldn't have done this without you. And I think for a first podcast in the cyber intel space, I think it's gone pretty well from my perspective. So thank you so much.
Ross, thank you for the opportunity of sharing, and I look forward to learning from those who follow me. And there are some better people out there, lots of better people. So I look forward to learning as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Have a great evening. Have a good time. As far as COVID goes, we're all in lockdown in our various places, trying to make the best we can out of the situation, which is again another big reason for launching a channel. So be safe and be careful as we sort of start to open up the travel restrictions and things like that over time. So as I said, thank you all for your listening. Bye for now.